Welcome to the Law Society Younger Members Committee Career Information Session number 2. Madeline Thornton talks to Barry McLaughlin about how to impress at interview.
Again, welcome. I'm here with Barry McLaughlin and my name is Madeline Thornton. So welcome everybody. And I just see the time has started at 7 o'clock. So I was just going to, again, thank Barry for being here tonight and let him tell you about what he does, what the Communication Clinic does. So I'll let you talk, Barry.
Okay, Madeline, well thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to Michelle, who organised this, and Keith, who helped facilitate the technology and everything. My name is Barry McLaughlin. First of all, I am a solicitor, a qualified solicitor, not practicing anymore. And I suppose to make it very clear, I didn't leave the profession under a cloud or run off to Brazil or anything like that at all. I think like a lot of people, when I qualified, very different time. There was we were in the middle of the Celtic Tiger. And I suppose within 7 or 8 years of qualification, things changed a bit. People maybe would have changed careers or maybe used their legal skills in a different format, whether they went in-house or did something else. And I suppose in 2011, I found myself in a situation where, the work that I used to do, buying and selling houses and conveyancing and all that, just simply stopped. I took it as an opportunity maybe to do something else. I was always interested in communications, but also in terms of helping people with interviews and preparation. And actually going through the interview process myself to get the job and work for the company I'm working for, was actually quite an experience. I think many of us have been in that situation where you do the interview, it doesn't go well, you don't know how to develop yourself or progress. And I suppose I've been through it myself, but also I work professionally with people now to help them improve not only how they present themselves at interview, but how they improve things like presentations, speeches, how they run meetings, how they're impactful, and things like how they, for example, perform in media and things like that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is how you kind of make an impression in that short time you have in the interview to get your point across and to make yourself as memorable and relevant to the people who are interviewing you.
Well, thank you, Barry, and I know you've helped hundreds of people at interview. But the first question that I'm just going to put to you tonight is, this whole new world that we're in now, Zoom. Obviously, I'm assuming many interviews are held via Zoom. So, how does a candidate deal with those kind of Zoom interviews and succeed? Any tips or insights you might have?
Yeah, and first of all, to give you an example, I would have prepared 3 people today for job interviews. Now, one of those people actually has a Zoom interview in the morning. So Zoom interviews are still happening, particularly for, say, first round interviews when they're maybe trying to screen people. I think one thing to remember about Zoom is that it tends to amplify good behaviors and bad behaviors. So what do we mean by good behaviors? Well, the first thing is you treat a Zoom call as you would any professional interaction. So, you're obviously dressed appropriately, you have an appropriate background, you make sure that your Wi-Fi and everything is working. So, I mean, those things you can control in terms of the atmosphere. And I'd also be very clear with anyone in the house or in the vicinity, I need this hour clear. You don't want cats or dogs or family members wandering in as well. So just, be a little bit assertive at the beginning and say, I need this to work and I need to be very clear. Obviously just do a dry run in terms of checking lighting and things like that. One thing I noticed though interesting, I was preparing someone recently for an interview and they were in a beautiful conservatory, and suddenly out of the blue, the sun came out and absolutely it was like bathing the place in light, but we couldn't see anything. And so actually somebody was basically concerned. We had to say, look, you just have to be careful about if there's a sudden burst of sunlight, which can happen in this country at the time you're doing the interview, it's going to be distracting. So maybe a room where you can control the light. So that's kind of the physical setup. The other thing is, we've seen people who maybe have maybe written out answers in front of them, and they kind of sometimes caught themselves and think, well, they can't see me, so really they won't be able to see me reading something. Actually, if you break eye contact, it's actually quite obvious on a Zoom call. So the advice I'd always give people is the same advice for any interview. learn your answers off. And what I mean by that is practice them out loud. It's like when you stood up in court or you're talking to a client. If you say something for the first time, it's more than likely going to go wrong. So hear yourself say it out loud. Get verbally familiar with what you're going to say. The one difference with a Zoom interview is it's very hard to pick up on body language. So for example, if Matt was interviewing me in person, I could get a sense from her body language if she was happy with the answer or she wanted me to wrap up. So if you've answered the question, don't be afraid to verbalize and say, Madeline, have I answered your question? You know, if you're any doubt that you haven't answered, now obviously you're not going to do it every answer, but just make sure that you're doing that as well. If anyone kind of wants to get a more detailed analysis of Zoom calls and Zoom interviews, my colleague Sarah Geraghty has written an article. It's actually up on our LinkedIn webpage about how to do Zoom interviews and impress on Zoom. It was also in the Sunday Business Post magazine last week. So if anyone can access that and have a look at that, it's a really good analysis of not only just interviews, but how to perform and present yourself in a way that's appropriate so that you're not losing out in the long term.
Okay, very good, because you know, Zoom is slightly different to real-time interviews, you know. But what about stress and nerves at interview?
Yeah.
I mean, that is as relevant in Zoom as it is in the real world. How does a candidate deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first thing I'd say to anyone who's watching, if you do get nervous before an interview, congratulations. First of all, it means you're taking the thing seriously. And I'm always happy when people say, look, I am a bit nervous. So when we get nervous, there's a fairly significant physical reaction in your body. You get a shot of adrenaline, your temperature goes up, your metabolism shoots up, you might start to perspire, your mouth might go dry. There's a couple of things you can do. The first thing is that, again, going back to what I said earlier, practice your answers out loud. You're more likely to remember something when you're under pressure if you've heard yourself say it out loud a few times. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what those answers should look like. The second thing is, if you do have symptoms, so let's say, for example, you're somebody that maybe perspires a lot, or you feel your throat dries out, you try and do something about it. So for example, I always say to my clients when we're doing Zoom interview prep, have you got a glass of water? And half of them will go, no, I don't. I never thought of that, even though the kitchen is just over here. If you went into a normal interview, you'd be offered a glass of water. So get a glass of water, make sure it's still water, not sparkling. Sparkling water can actually irritate your throat. If you're somebody, you know, for example, that, as I say, maybe you feel you perspire or whatever, just get an antiperspirant. There's a brand of antiperspirant called Mitchum, and we would often give it to people who, you know, for example, if they're in real life situations, maybe they get clammy hands when they're nervous. Rub it on your hands. You don't have to worry about it. So there's a something for every symptom. One of the symptoms that a lot of people talk to us about is they feel that their voice goes or starts to move up and down. And I actually remember the first time I stood up in court, and that nerves, you kind of feel like you're almost, oh God, is my voice too high or too low? Am I going to impress the judge or whatever? And I just say to you, the larynx is it's a physical movement. We can actually feel it moving and vibrating. And actually 9 times out of 10, it's never as bad as it sounds when it comes out. The one thing that happens to people's voices is sometimes they go very quiet before an interview. So they don't talk to anyone for 15 minutes. And they're hugely surprised when the interview starts and the person says, you know, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And the first thing out of your mouth is because your voice is kind of seized up. So also make sure that you have a glass of water, just something to drink, but warm up your voice. You know, talk to someone beforehand, even talk to yourself. Okay. A question came in there about, I think, in relation to redness. You know, people who blush, and that's actually something people experience a lot. And some people would blush kind of from the neck up. There's a couple of things. First of all, for what a lot of women find very useful is something like green concealer. Just rub it on under your makeup, and it's very very useful. Not many men I know would wear or have green concealer. The one thing I would say is that 9 times out of 10, it's never as bad as you feel. I've had plenty of people who I've interviewed, and they say, God, I'm blushing, and we'd say, well, look, just have a quick look in the mirror there, and they'd look and go, oh, actually, it's not that bad. But I think if you do get that nervous feeling, the simplest thing you can do is slow your breathing down. So there's a little technique, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in for 3 seconds, hold it for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then exhale for 5. So you're lengthening your exhalation and then you're breathing in again. And if you do that for about a minute, you start to take the edge off all of those symptoms, the sweating, the red, the blushing, and the general feeling of kind of queasiness. The last symptom I'll just talk about, and something we hear a lot of, people get shaky hands, the hands start to tremble a little bit. A little technique, if you can imagine, I'm sitting down here in my chair, hold your arms down by your side, ball them into a fist, so your arms are gone really locked tight like this. And if you hold that for about 35 or 40 seconds, and then slowly let go, your hands will stop shaking. Because what you've actually done is you've built up lactic acid in your arms and they can't shake. So these are all little techniques that people use when they're just trying to manage their nerves.
They're really fantastic tips, Barry, really are. And actually, once somebody asked that very question about, how to cope with nerves as well. And I think you took all of the points there in an answer. So what would be typical questions? How does that candidate prepare? They'd want to know what would typical questions be at interview.
Okay. Well, I think we can kind of break the questions into probably 3 or 4 categories. The first thing I'd say is that you're always certainly going to get an introductory question, and we'll call it a concluding question. So tell us about yourself, summarize your career, walk us through your CV, why do you think you're suitably qualified? Now, what a lot of people do is, because we're lawyers and we're very pedantic, we start, from my case, you start in County Offaly, you went to college in Limerick, you trained up in Dublin, and now you're here. So you kind of, this is my life. And in fact, what you really want to do is maybe start the other way. Start with your most recent role or most recent experience and give a summary that kind of encapsulates, 12 years of legal experience, worked in a variety of sectors, but can I give you a sense of maybe 2 or 3 recent achievements that I think are relevant for this role? So what you're doing is you're signaling to the interview panel, I have done things and there's stuff here in my career that is relevant to you. And I would then reverse that essentially at the end of the interview. Why should we give you the job? And I suppose the first answer is because I'm hardworking, I'm dedicated, I'm a great lawyer, I've got a great attention to detail. And again, anybody can say that. But if you can give a summary that just reminds people of 2 or 3 specific achievements, again, I was the guy that brought in client X, I was the guy that expanded Division Y, I was also one of the people involved in that big Supreme Court case we had, or whatever it is. That makes you more memorable. And the beginning and the end of the interview is quite important, because as anybody who's ever stood up in a courtroom knows, the first thing you say to a judge or jury and the last thing you say to a judge and jury, that's when people are paying attention. So that's that first kind of introduction, conclusion. Second question is your motivation. And I suppose the key thing I'd say here is you'll be asked the question 2 ways. Why do you want to leave your current job? Why do you want to work for us? If you're asked, why do you want to leave your current job? You're really pivoting to why I want to work for you. Because nobody wants to hear how unhappy you are or limited you are or bored you are in your current job. So the idea is that you don't diss your colleagues. You don't kind of make a big song and dance about how bad things are. You just talk about maybe it in terms of what they are trying to achieve. Nobody was going to hire you to fulfill your career ambitions. But if you've done a little bit of researching and say, look, I see you're a new company, I see you've got very interesting clients in the area of intellectual property, that's something I'm really interested in, and that's one of the reasons I've applied for the role. You're actually offering yourself in service rather than, well, I want this job because it'll be good for my career. So there's that kind of motivation question as well. I think the third kind of question that comes up, and these are the ones that will always come up, are the competencies. A good job spec will lay out the competencies. For lawyers, there are things like research, organizational skills, attention to detail, negotiation, communication, commercial focus. That's a big one. Do you want to get a sense, we can be all great lawyers, but can we turn that into a profitable set of files? So for each of the competencies, there's a simple structure. Now, some of you may be familiar with the STAR matrix, but there's another structure we think is much more effective. So let's say, for example, Madeline asks me, am I good in research? What the worst answer is where you just repeat, you're good at research. A really effective answer starts with a really good example. Absolutely, I'm good in research. Can I give you a quick example of where I was asked to do a significant piece of research for one of the partners in the firm or whatever? And in your example, give a sense of scale, you know, how much was involved, even the quantum of the case, if you're not giving away information. But that sells to someone listening, gosh, that was a significant piece of work. So the first thing is we have an example.
Mm.
The second thing we need is a positive outcome. You need to be able to talk about what it is you were able to do in terms of what was a success. So was the research accepted? So for example, when the affidavit was submitted to the court, was it accepted? Was the judge happy with it? Was whatever. And so you have an example and you have an outcome. And the third element is try and describe the behaviors that you demonstrated that led to that success. Now, any of you who've gone for public service jobs, the competencies will always be described in terms of certain behaviors. So the research, they'll say, it looks far and wide to gather data and information. And I think it's very useful for you to not only say you've done research well, you have a good example, but what's your method? So what I do is I look up LexisNexis, I look up the law journals, I cross-reference, I might talk to some colleagues. But what that gives me is a very, very good sense of the situation. I'm able to apply that to my research. It's been very effective so far, and that's what I would do and continue to do in the role. So you're actually pulling out your own good behaviors. So that, if you can think about it, guys, for those competencies. And the other way they might ask the question would be where they throw you a scenario. What would you do in this situation? And the danger is you turn it into, well, here's what I do. I go over there, I look at that, I research that, and then I do that. And most people leave the answer at that. And the really good and memorable candidate will say, I've actually done that. Can I give you a quick example of where I've done something similar? And I suppose really what we're trying to avoid with the competencies is, they're going to come up, but we don't want you walking out going, oh, I should have said that. So that's why practicing your answers out loud, sitting down like you would do any legal work when you're starting a file, you go, right, okay, what are the things they're looking for here? Have I got an example for each of them? Is there a good outcome? And can I describe in broad strokes what I did? If you can do that, excellent. And then you start practicing out loud to get that. The final type of question, it doesn't come up that often, but the ones we see would be awareness of yourself and awareness of the industry. So, the awareness of self might be the old turkey, have you any weaknesses? Now, I think the employment lawyers in the room would probably shiver at that question, because that's not really an effective question to ask a candidate. But they might phrase it in a way like, how do you keep your skills up to date? Or, is there anything you'd change about maybe the way you've done things? And I would say to people that, candidates of mine, don't treat the question as therapy. You're not there. It's not a place in an interview to admit or proclaim a weakness. I think what you really need to do is say, look, actually, if I give you an example of maybe something I have to go off and learn, the impression you want to be giving and the evidence you want to give is, I'm continuously developing myself. They don't call it CPD for nothing. That I'm constantly looking to get my skills. And if you can give an example where you've upgraded your skills and been able to use them in the office subsequently, that's a really effective answer. So that's that self-awareness. The other awareness is the awareness of the sector. So are you familiar with new cases? I always think that, it's almost unforgivable for anybody going for an interview not to be reading the Gazette and looking at recent cases. What are the decisions in Europe? What are the decisions in the High Court? That you can talk at some length, that you keep on top of things. You don't have to be an expert, but you're familiar with the way things are going as well. I just saw a question come in there, Madeline, as well, about graduate interviews. I think all of the questions I've talked about would come up. There will be two other questions for graduate interviews that do come up. One is there a legal story that caught your eye? So it's a little bit like what I talked about a minute ago. Are you keeping an eye on what's happening in the legal world or what's going on? And I remember a recruiter from one of the big law firms gave me a very good bit of advice. They said that if your commercial or legal case that you've studied or read about that you find interesting is in the news, it's not interesting. You want to find something that other people haven't spotted or seen. So if you're going on about, well, the internal market bill that's currently wending its way through the House of Commons is very interesting. No, it's not. Everyone is going to talk about that. So try and pick something, and ideally something that is relevant to the sector that you're going into. The second question for graduates that they will be asked, we're seeing a lot of, particularly the bigger firms, is your own kind of personal life in terms of things like volunteering, corporate social responsibility. So are you somebody that's been involved in St. Vincent de Paul? Are you involved in charities, sports? Do that sense of that, I'm prepared to give back, do pro bono work or whatever. That's of huge importance to companies. A lot of companies now, if you look at their websites, the big law firms, it's front and center of what they do. They're very proud of the pro bono work they do, of their corporate social responsibility. And it's very important that you get that across as well. Okay. Someone has asked there if you don't know the answer to a question. And actually, that's a really interesting one for a lawyer, because I think sometimes we kind of put ourselves under a bit of pressure. If I was to ask somebody to quote me the relevant piece of the Constitution that covers the right to home ownership, I don't think I'm ever going to get a question like that in an interview. But what I would say is that, first of all, if you're asked a question about a particular piece of legislation, you don't know the answer, the next best thing you can do is say, well, look, can I tell you where I would find the information, or how I would get it, and where I've done it before? Because remember, as lawyers, we're not paid to carry Bunrock and Heron around between our ears. What we are paid to do is to be able to access relevant and up-to-date information to advise our clients as quickly as possible. The other thing then, if you genuinely don't know the answer to a question, you have two options. The first option is say, I don't know. The second option is go ahead and prove you don't know by trying to spoof it. And you're better off not to do that. Say, look, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that. If it was in a situation in the office, I would know how to find the answer out to that. But off the top of my head, I can't tell you that. Okay.
Very good. I was going to ask you next, it's very important to have as you said at the start, to have a very good opening at an interview. And what about closing? How do you do a good closing at an interview? Are there any questions that you shouldn't ask at that point? If asked, do you have any questions? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great one. I think the first thing, just to reiterate again, if I was concluding the interview, I do a very quick summary of my career and remind them of a couple of key achievements. Somewhere on the internet, there is probably a website that says you must ask a question at the end of an interview, because everyone that I've ever met has said, well, you have to ask a question. Now, I'm slightly agnostic on that. I would ask a question based on research and make sure you're asking somebody who can answer the question. You don't want a situation where you've been interviewed by a HR person and the head of probate, and you go in asking an interesting question on litigation, and they're looking at each other going, I don't know. If you're going to ask a question, it should be about the organization, and it shouldn't be a question you should already know the answer to. So ideally, you base it on research. So for example, if a company have recently made an announcement that they're opening up a division in a certain area, good questions. Can you tell me how that area is going? Do you interact with many of the other divisions? But you encourage them to talk about themselves. If you can't do anything like that, or for example, if you're going for an internal interview, if you've been promoted internally, and you've been in the company for 7 or 8 years, what kind of question do you ask? Well, it's very hard to ask a question that you shouldn't know the answer to. So one of the things I would suggest to people is something like this. Have you any questions? I don't. The specification is very clear. I've worked in this role for a long time. I know the people involved. I know what's expected, and I don't have any questions. So sometimes it's okay to say no, as long as you explain why you're saying no. That's all.
Do you ever ask at that point, would it be a big no-no to ask about terms and conditions, or is that a...
Yeah, it would. I know we're all very good negotiators and we want to get in and sort out the deal, but you're not at the point of even being offered anything. Mm. And also, at the end of an interview, that's when people are kind of making up their mind, and you don't want to do anything to diminish yourself. The point is that, I'll preface this by saying, unless they ask you, a question, say, well, look, what are your salary expectations? And to deal with that, again, I go back and do my research. There's a couple of really good recruitment agencies like CPL, Brightwater, HRM. They do what they do is they actually do salary surveys. And even the Law Society, I'm sure, can help you out in terms of if you're 3 years post-qualified in probate in Dublin or 4 years post-qualified in litigation in Cork, you can roughly work out what the market is going to bear and pay you. And that's where I'd start. So I'm looking for the market rate. Market rate at my research is X, Y, or Z. I'm happy to talk to you about it. But you're given a realistic figure. It's based on, you're not doing the L'Oreal ad because I'm worth it. You're actually saying, well, look, this is what the market is bearing. And you're not ruling yourself in or out. Okay. I think a question came in there about gaps in a CV.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, about CVs and covering letters and how to deal with all of that.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that, and we'll get to the gaps bit in a minute, for CVs and cover letters, first of all, every CV should be tailored specifically for the job you're going for. And it's one of the simplest ways to do that is there's a skills profile most people have at the top of every CV. You should reference the skills that they're actually looking for in the role. So for example, a big firm will probably put down things like someone who can work in a team and is comfortable in taking instructions from different people. And if you can speak to that, that should be in your profile. Smaller firms might look for people who work on their own initiative or whatever. The point is, you look at the job spec and you match the competencies and the skills that they're looking for. You highlight those. There's no point in saying that you've got 4 years experience working in court number 6 and you put that in every CV if it's not actually not what they're looking for. The biggest mistake I do see in CVs is that they describe activity but not achievement. So anyone can describe the job you did Monday to Friday, but I'd like to know how well you did at the end of the day, the week, the month, the quarter, the year. So what are the things you did well? What worked? What was the achievement? And that gets you in the habit then as well of thinking about it for your actual interview too. A couple of things on the CV: spelling mistakes, grammatic mistakes, complete no-nos. You can't do that. The cover letter should not be a repetition of the CV. Broadly speaking, the cover letter should have 3 main bits. First part, job you're applying for, the reference number, just to be very clear, because some big firms will have a lot of jobs, and if they have to start working out what CV the job is for, they lose heart very easily. It's not a good impression. Second paragraph, why you're interested in the role. Third paragraph, brief summary of your own career and key achievements. I don't think you need to go much more than a page. Some of the graduate programs, people getting training contracts, they are a little bit more elaborate and they work for specific information. Somebody asked about a gap in the CV. I would account for it, but I'd also make it clear in terms of if you were studying anything, if you kept your CPD up to date, if you were doing any voluntary work. So as long as there's something there that you can say, well, look, I was doing something, or collecting my CPD points, or keeping an eye on the Law Gazette, that's quite acceptable. I mean, it's not unusual for people to have been out of work or people to be looking for opportunities. And as long as the gap is explained, it's much better to do that in the CV, and then you can elaborate at the interview than perhaps maybe they're looking at, look, we don't know what happened here. He was off the picture here for 2 years. It could have been anything. We might pass this time. So I'd always make sure. There's an old saying in journalism: ambiguity excites my curiosity, but not for a good reason here. So if you've been ambiguous, that might be a mark against you.
I see there's another question in here, and it's just about if you're changing from one area of expertise to another, for example, criminal to corporate, how would you tailor your experience in one area to apply for that job that you're seeking? So I might just ask that question.
That's a great question. I think what I would do, first of all, is I'd make sure that you try and focus on, well, what are the key skills that are common to both roles? So, for example, in criminal law, a lot of it will be, significant amount of work. There's a heavy caseload. Anyone who does criminal law, a number of deadlines. Your ability to meet deadlines, calmness under pressure, being able to negotiate, and able to be assertive. So I would pull out all the things that would make you effective as a lawyer and make sure you're referencing those when you're looking to change careers. So you're taking out the common skills and making those relevant there as well.
I'd just like to thank Barry McLaughlin, Michelle Nolan and Keith O'Malley and all the people attending this evening to our information session on how to impress at interview. So thank you all, and I'm just going to end this information session for all. Thank you.